Good evening, everyone. Welcome back, or welcome for the first time if this is your first time joining us for this class, or for any Drisha class. We're very happy to have you here learning with us. This is Rabbi Silber's class on the Siddur, and the text is the Siddur. There might be a couple additional supplemental texts this evening, and if you don't have them on hand, if you don't have your own personal Beit Midrash, me too. But luckily, thankfully, we all have Sefaria, so I will do my best to keep those texts on screen in the right position at the appropriate time. If you are joining us on Zoom, please accept my invitation to become a panelist. Please feel free to turn your camera on, but do keep yourself muted unless you are intending to share your sound during a question and answer discussion period. Rabbi Silber is very good about giving plenty of time for people to ask deeper questions and get to all the things we're thinking about. If you would prefer to write in the chat, you are welcome to do that at any time. If you're joining us on Facebook Live, please post your questions and comments right below the video in the comments section. And if you're joining us on Drisha Live, we're really glad that you're here. So without further ado, Rabbi Silber, please.
Thank you, Noah. Okay, just to pick up briefly on what we saw last week. So last week, the Amidah begins with a bracha, and it says Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. So we spoke a bit last week about the dual, my God or our God, and then the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We spoke about that, and we noted that approaching God as the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov is found in several places, most notably in the story of the burning bush, where God both addresses Moshe by saying, I am the God of your father, Elohei Avicha, that is to say, the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And then later in that very chapter, Moshe strangely says to God, when I go to the people, because his mission is to take them out of Mitzrayim, when I go to the people, they will ask me, what is the name of this God? To which God seems to give two different answers. But the second answer, tell them that the God of Avram, Yitzchak, the God of your ancestors, Elohei Avotechem, the God of your forefathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, spoke to you. That's my name. Zeshmi Riolam, V'Zezechri L'Dar Dar. So my point last week was, when we encountered this expression in this rabbinic construction we call the Amidah, but the rabbinic construction is essentially based on a variety of biblical verses. And it's an invitation for us to think about those verses as they appear in the Torah in various places. In this case, notably, the story of the snare, where it appears twice. It appears both in identifying God to Moshe, and I would say identifying Moshe to Moshe. Because in the story of Moshe, we remember Moshe seems to have many mothers, but has no father. And what God is saying is, I am the God of your father. Let me tell you who your father is. Your father is Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So there's both an identification of the God who speaks, but there's also an identification of Moshe. And then later Moshe is told, when the people ask, what is the name of this God? Tell the people, I'm the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the God of your forefathers, the God of your parents. So just to reflect for a further moment about the story of the snare, and in thinking about these stories as we are engaged in the activity we call prayer, of which the Amidah is the central prayer that we have. So there are a couple of points I wanted to emphasize about the snare. First of all, the story of the snare is about somebody who was given a particular task, a mission. And when God first addresses Moshe in chapter 3, we remember Moshe's first words are Hineni. Hineni means I am here for you. I'm present. I'm fully present. So Moshe actually agrees to the mission before he even knows what the mission is. Then when he finds out what the mission is, he has a fair amount of resistance. He says, maybe I'm not the right person. I really can't do it. He has all kinds of reasons, stated reasons why he can't do it. And when somebody gives you 5 reasons why they can't do it, usually the true reason, or often the true reason, is not stated at all. For some other reason, he's very reluctant to take on the mission. At the end of the day, though, he does accept it. So in thinking about the snare, I think a central point of the snare is it's about a mission. If we think about this in terms of prayer, what prayer is about, we talked about commitment last week. We mentioned taking the vow, that both Yaakov and Hannah take vows, that prayer is a vow. So it's about commitment, but it's also about mission. It's an opportunity to think, what is my mission? Each of us has a mission. What is my mission? And am I fulfilling the mission? Am I not fulfilling the mission? And there are a lot of good reasons that we are reluctant to fulfill the mission. Moshe had many reasons. Moshe had many arguments, many claims. I'm not the right person. I can't do it. There's other people do it better. All kinds of, I'm not a good speaker. Moshe has many. At the end of the day, though, he said hineni, he accepts it. So prayer then, one way to see prayer, which I think is central to prayer, is it's an opportunity to think about where I stand in this world and what I'm doing and maybe what I could or should be doing, with an understanding that it's not simple. It's not simple to know whether this is in fact my mission, and it's not simple to know it because some things that we might want to do or think we should be doing are not within our purview, are too difficult, or maybe there are others to do it better. Those are Moshe's arguments. So that's point number 1 in thinking about the snare. There are many points about the snare. It's a very rich story. The second point about the snare, which I think is central to our Amidah, is that essentially what God is saying to Moshe is, this is your mission, and you are the son of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. And last week we explained that in terms of revelation. God speaks to Moshe. God speaks to Avram. God speaks to Yitzchak. God speaks to Yaakov. God speaks to the Avot, as we call them, and they speak back. It's a dialogue, prayer. And now God is speaking after many years to Moshe for the first time. In the interim, God does not speak. And the very idea of the sneh, which stands in for revelation, a kind of mini revelation. But the point over here is that Moshe is identified as, you are the son of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And when the people ask you, what is the name of this God? You ought to say to them, says God, tell them that the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, that's my name, the God of your ancestors. That's found in chapter 3. Let's find that verse in chapter 3. I think that's not the verse that's on the board over there, though that does mention Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. But the verse I'm referring to is verse number, if I could read this over here, 15. Chapter 3, verse 15. So let's see. 15, that's verse a little more down. Yes, right. God said further to Moshe, Kol Tomar, say this to Bnei Yisrael. Hashem Elohei Avotechem, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Shlachani, the God of Avram, of your ancestors, your father's house, your fathers. Namely, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov sent me. That's my name. Zeshmi Li'olam, Zezruchi L'Dardar. That's my name for all eternity. In other words, the point is, they are your brothers, because you are related to them, because your father is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and their father is Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And that's something interesting about prayer, that in prayer, the Amidah is intended not only to be a private prayer. I mean, it's a communal prayer and it's a private prayer. But even when it's a private prayer, the language is actually it's all in plural. So it's all, we'll see this later on. Even verses that are written in the singular appear in the Amidah in the plural form. So the idea that we pray not alone, or not only for ourselves, but our prayers for ourselves are also prayers for the larger community, for the world, perhaps, or maybe a local community, or all of Israel. There are multiple possibilities, which are not mutually exclusive. And the fact of the matter is, that's an interesting idea that basically my own prayers, I'm seeing my own prayers in terms of the larger needs. And in thinking about the Amidah, and of course, the story that always comes back to us when we think about the Amidah, obviously, is the story of Chana. The silent prayer of Chana is the basis for the Amidah. That's the core prayer. And Chana is not just praying for herself. The story of Chana is she wants a child. She wants to have her own child. So she prays for herself in that sense. But of course, what she says is, if you give me a child, I'll give the child back to you. This child will be in the service of God, that is to say, in the service of the people for his entire life. So in other words, there's a connection between the private prayer on one hand and the communal on the other. So that also, we think about the sneh as we see these words, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we're thinking about the sneh. And we're thinking about the difficulty of the mission. In the case of Moshe, it's difficult for many reasons, apart from the reasons that he gives. So we know when someone gives us 10 reasons, usually the real reason is something else. And the fact of the matter is, there's an unstated reason, which is he's happy where he is. He's run away from the land of Egypt. He was forced to run away because his own people, in one form or another, have forced him to run away. Whether they actually told Paro what he did, that he had killed the Egyptian, or they just talked and didn't keep their mouths shut, that's a good question. But one way or the other, this quarrelsome people that he tried to help, and they said to him, who made you the judge? Who made you the prince? Who made you the leader? You're going to kill me the way you killed the Egyptian? They forced him to run away. Pharaoh hears and he runs away. And he's happy where he is. He comes to the land of Midian. He meets the daughters of the priest, Reuel, God's friend. And he and Reuel are fast friends because they see the world the same way. They're both consumed with a sense of justice. So he has this holy man, this priest, and he's married to his daughter, and he has a job, and he has security, and it's someone that he really can identify with. They identify with each other. How come you're home so early, my daughters? Some Egyptian man saved us. He saved you? Bring him here for supper. He saved you. He saved the weak from the stronger. This is the person that I want to meet. Bring him here. So Moshe and Yitro have a deep connection. But of course, in chapter 3, we remember in the story of the burning bush. In chapter 2, his name is Reuel, the friend of God. But in chapter 3, Moshe was watching the flock of his father-in-law, Yitro. And Yitro and Reuel, it's the same person, but they mean two different things. Reuel is God's friend. Yitro is from Yeter or Miyutar. What is Miyutar? Superfluous. Moshe's mission involves him, by definition, leaving his friend, maybe one might even say his Rabbi, his holy man. They see the world the same way. They're concerned with justice, with helping the weak saving the weak from the strong. And he has to go back. Why must he go back? Because he loves Yitro, but he's not his brother. His particular mission is to save his brother. As he says later on, I want to go see if my brethren is still alive. The idea of brother is very central to Sefer Shemot. And his own brother, Aaron, is going to help him. But that sometimes the mission involves leaving things behind that are very dear to us because we have a different mission. We have to be in a different place. So in thinking about the sneh, as we stand in prayer, and we're thinking about making commitments, and with wondering about what is my mitzvah of the moment, what is my mission, what is my task, and we're thinking about, can I do it? It's very difficult. What would it entail? These are all the things we're thinking about when we say these words, Elokeinu v'Elokei Avotenu. This is one of the stories we're thinking about. There are others. But my point is that in thinking about the text that lie behind the prayer, suddenly the prayer is opened up to many, many possibilities. And there's a lot more in the snare, some of which we mentioned last week. I'm not going to go over it again. But that is, I think, a good example of how, in thinking about the biblical bases of our prayers, it suddenly opens up the prayer. And the very same words can mean different things on different days. They can mean different things on the same day, all kinds of different possibilities. But the idea that prayer is about my own commitments, my own obligations, my own task in this world is something that I think we will encounter several times in our study of the Amidah. So I just want to finish up in terms of what we started last week with this expression, my God, my own personal God, as we said, which is, as Yaakov says, I have my own mission. My father, my grandfather couldn't do it. To build a community, to build a family, to build a bayit. That's the mission of Yaakov as he understands it. I'm also the son of Isaac and the grandson of Abraham, of course, but I'm also Yaakov. And if you give me the opportunity, you'll be my God, me, the way with my abilities. So that's Elokeinu, and then there's Elokei Avotenu, of course, the idea of revelation that we're part of a prayer community over time, because the Avot all prayed. And in thinking about that expression, of course, it allows us to focus in on, among other stories, the story of the snare and what that might suggest to us. Okay, let me stop here for a moment. If there are any comments and questions about this, I'll be happy to try to respond. If not, we'll just continue. If the questions emerge, if there's something later about this, you can also speak up. So we'll have a couple of other pauses, and you can also put stuff in the chat. Yes.
Can you elaborate on the idea of Yitro being extra, like he doesn't need him anymore? Is that what you mean?
I'm not sure he needs him or not. Yitro is not a Jew. Yitro is a Midianite priest. And that Moshe's task is to save his brothers. By the way, there's a novel based on that story. As a kid, I don't read that many novels. I'm not saying that's positive, but there's a novel by Verf, The 40 Days of Musa Dag. Anybody here read that novel? It's one of my mother had these certain books she recommended to me. 40 Days of Musa Dag, Franz Werfel, and it's based on the story of Moshe. It's about the Armenians, the Armenian genocide. And he is this person, Musa Dag, the mountain of Har Sinai, basically. The 40 days of Musa Dag is someone who was called, he understands God is calling him, that's his mission, is to leave what he has behind, to leave his family or whatever. Don't remember all the details, but he has to leave his life behind because he has a different calling. He leaves behind things that he loves. And that's the story of Moshe. From a certain perspective, it's a tragedy, actually. I mean, he loves Yitro. And Yitro comes later on and tells Moshe how to administer justice, because he's all about justice. But Moshe has left Yitro. Actually, he leaves Yitro initially, and then he seems to leave his wife and children behind also. He has a different mission in this world. His mission is to build a nation, is to teach a nation. That's his mission, which he grudgingly accepts because he understands the great difficulties. And at the end of the day, he's not going to enter that land. He's going to set it up for others, but he won't enter the land himself. He does see the land, which is not a small thing. So yes, I mean, to think about this, the mission, which is, it's not mission impossible, but it's mission very difficult. And it's, but he understands that's what he's being told to do. It's a very good question. How do you know what your mission is? How do you really know, say God is speaking to me? How do you know that? I may have mentioned to you that when I was living in Israel one year, I was in Alon Shvut, and there's a fellow who used to daven right near me, became a chassid, a very interesting person. And I once said to him, he says, what are you doing? He was both a mashkiach in the yeshiva and he was teaching second grade at the same time. And he said, I said, what's with you? He says, I'm not sure what the next step is now. And I'm waiting for God to tell me what to do. And I said, well, if God tells you what to do, are you going to hear it? He thought for a moment. He said, yes, I will. So it's a very good question. How do we know what God is telling us? How do we know when God is instructing us? That's a wonderful question. But Moshe doesn't have a question that God is instructing Moshe. He's wondering whether it's really right for him because, maybe you have the wrong guy. They're not going to believe me, all the excuses. But the idea that prayer is a moment of contemplation about where I stand in this world, what I am doing, what I should be doing. I think that's something which is central to the story of the snare. And I think it's central to prayer in general. And we'll have an opportunity to revisit this, hopefully more than once. Okay, so let me move now to the next. Yes, I see there's in the chat that the Slonim talks about how to know. Okay, I mean, this is a question. I would say that within certain communities, this is a basic question. I mean, I would say the term that I like to use is Eved Hashem, to be God's servant. The servant does what the master tells him to do. The question is, what is the master saying? That's the question. And this idea of being a servant means this is my purpose in the world. And there are people who have a very strong sense of this. This is what I am commanded to do. Not that I necessarily even enjoy it, but this is why I was put here. Everybody's put here for a purpose. So that is, to me, a very, very interesting question about how does one know? Can one know? But this idea of, understanding what my role is. And then we're asking God to give me the resources to do it. That's the point of the Amidah. If you think of it in these, which is the way I like, and later on we'll encounter this, maybe next week or the following week. Because what prayer then becomes is, okay, I stand before you. I think this is what I'm committed to do. But if I have no security, if I have no income, if I have poor health, if I have no insight, how can I do your will? I can't. So I need your help. Please help me out here and give me the resources, the emotional resources, the intellectual resources, the security, etc., and all that, which I need to do the work that I want to do for you. But that's basically one way to see the Amidah. It's a way that I think is a good way to see the Amidah, but there are other ways to see it as well. But we'll encounter this. Because that's part one. Let me get now to the second. Elokeinu, Elokei Avotenu, and then Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. So the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And what's interesting is that this idea that the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, this is actually very central to our prayers. And first of all, there's a Gemara. So we have a Gemara in Masechet Brachot, a famous Gemara, on Brachot of Kavlav Amud Bet. Is it possible? Yes, there it is, right there. Thank you. Itmar. So the Gemara says there's a dispute. Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Chaimina, Amar, Tfilot Avot Tiknum. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, Amar, Tfilot Keneged Tmidim Tiknum. So we have a well-known disagreement about the prayers. There were 3 daily prayers that the rabbi instituted. There's a question in general, if the obligation to pray is what they call a Torah obligation at all, or whether it's simply a rabbinic obligation. From the Torah, there's no obligation ever to pray. It's an opportunity, but not an obligation. And others think, no, there is an obligation to pray maybe once a day. That's the Rambam's famous Shita. But the Gemara is talking about this praying 3 times a day. There's a dispute. One opinion is Tfilot Avot Tiknum. The 3 prayers of the day were instituted by the Avot. It's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Avram instituted Shacharit, Yitzchak added Mincha, Yaakov prayed Ma'ariv and set it up for us. That's one view. And the other view is no. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi says they're based on the sacrifices in the temple. That is to say, The morning prayer is the two daily sacrifices in the temple called the tamid. One is brought in the morning and one is brought in the afternoon. And the fats of the sacrifice are burned even at night. So according to one view, the thrice daily prayer is connected to Midim, the sacrificial service, and the other, of course, is Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. The text of our Amidah mentions Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Right in the very beginning, we address God. What is your name? We address God as the God of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, which certainly suggests to us that in praying, the Amidah is an invitation for us to think about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. So let's read a little more in the Gemara. Let's scroll down a bit. Yes, right. So now it says, it was taught in a Braita, the Tannaitic statement, in accordance with the first opinion, and it's another Braita in accordance with the second opinion. So it was taught in a Braita. Right. Avram Tikein Tfilat Shacharit. This is a Braita. Braitas are an older text in the Gemara. It's like the Mishnah. So it's Braita means it wasn't in the Mishnah itself, but it is Mishnaic in the sense it's that time period. But it's Braita. It's outside the Mishnah, but of that period. So the following Braita was taught. It says Abraham instituted the morning prayer. So Avram prayed in the morning, as it is written, and there's a citation from the Torah. That Avram got up in the morning and he went to the place where he had stood, the place where he had stood before God. This is the so-called source that Avram prayed Shacharit in the morning. Fine. It said, Makom asher amad sham. He stood there. What is stood? V'yein Amidah el tefillah. And the word Amidah refers to prayer, as it says, Vayamod Pinchas Vayifarel. It says that Pinchas stood up, and Vayifarel, they take it to mean prayer. It's a verse in Tehillim. So this is the source that Abraham prayed Tfilat Shacharit. Now, let's just think about this for a moment, about what this source suggests to us. First of all, the source that Abraham got up and returned to the place where he had stood before God, which is Abraham had praised to God in chapter 18. There it doesn't mention the morning at all. Abraham prays to God in chapter 18 about Sodom. He argues with God. Maybe they're 50 righteous people. You're going to kill everybody? If they're 50 righteous people, you kill the righteous as well? Oh no, says God, if they're 50 righteous, I won't kill anybody. And then he negotiates 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. And then he finishes with 10, and that's the end of that. That's chapter 18. Chapter 19, God destroys Sodom. And in this pasuk, it says that Avram got up in the morning and he went back to the place where he had stood before God. It doesn't actually say he prays then. He prayed earlier. But they're taking Vayamod, Asher Amad Sham, that he's praying again. In fact, he goes back to the same place where he prayed earlier. Now the question is, I'll ask you, because the Gemara doesn't say, what is he praying for in verse number 27? They're taking this verse, which is not what the plain meaning is at all, obviously, but they're taking this verse to mean he got up in the morning and he went back to the place where he had prayed. All that seems to say is he went back in the morning to the place that he had prayed, but it doesn't suggest that he prays in the morning. It means next morning he went back there. So I presume what it means is they think he's praying again, right? He gets up in the morning, he goes back to the place where he had prayed, and I think it means, and he again prays. But what is he praying for now? So I think what they're understanding, I could be wrong about this, but I think they're picking up on verse number 29. Because Vayhi b'shachet Elohim et areach kikar, Vayiskar Elohim et Avraham, Vayishalach et Lot mitocha hafecha. That here it says that God, who destroyed all of Sodom, but he saved Lot. So God is saving Lot. So maybe the additional prayer, he doesn't pray this in chapter 18. In chapter 18, he stops at 10. He doesn't even mention Lot, his nephew. But over here it says that God remembered Abraham and sent out a load from amidst the destruction. So maybe they're understanding it, possibly, that he returned to the same place to continue his prayer. In other words, he stopped at 10 on the previous prayer, but next morning, he gets up early in the morning, and Avram's thinking, okay, maybe I could now a special prayer for Lot, for my nephew Lot. And in fact, the Torah does say that even as God is destroying all the cities, but God sends Lot out on account of Abraham, because God remembers Abraham. So perhaps an understanding that he prayed for Lot. So what's interesting here is, first of all, the text, certainly the plain reading of the text does not suggest that it's about prayer, but that's the rabbinic understanding, rabbinic interpretation. But what's interesting is, so this particular prayer is a prayer for somebody else. He's not praying for himself. He's praying for the other. Let's start with that. That's number one. And number two, when thinking about this story of Vayashkem Avraham Baboker, he's also returning back to the same place. What is that actually about? Because we have a halacha, for example, to have a makom kavua. So the Gemara speaks about having a fixed place for prayer, a certain place where you pray, and you go back to that same place. And the idea of having a fixed place for prayer strikes me that this is exactly the rabbinic understanding, at least, the suggestion that the Gemara makes about Abraham, that he gets up in the morning and he goes back to that place. There's something he hasn't said yet. There's something else he wants to add to his prayer. It's interesting. He's adding to the prayer because he didn't pray for Lot in the previous prayer. He stopped at 10. Here he's going back and praying again. And he's going back first thing in the morning, right away. He's going back right away, early, the first, Hayashkem Baboker. So what do we make of this? What are they picking up? What are they picking up over here? What is this idea in general about Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov? What do we take from that? Yeah, Zoe, you want to say something?
Yeah, so in this specific case, they're picking up on the fact that Abraham stood, because there are two other cases where I'm sure you know, where he gets up in the morning, but we don't have that he stood. And so they're interested in this word, like why is he standing? And that's what they're taking as prayer, because the other two times that he gets up early are before Ishmael leaves his house and right before the Akedah. So you could understand this as like, these are Abraham's most contemplative moments. Like these are the times he's being tested, but this is the only one of the three where he stands.
Right, so for sure they're picking up on the word, as they say, the word Amidah, which is interesting. I mean, because what does the word Amidah suggest about prayer? That's a very good question. It's called the Amidah. In other words, the very fact that we stand in prayer, that our core prayer is standing. Now, we also bow in a certain way, but we don't fall to the ground. And in other religions, that's not true. In Islam, it's certainly not true. They're on the ground, right? And the different religions have different stances during prayer. So that's a very interesting question about what we make of the very fact that our prayer is Amidah. Now, we do have, after we pray, what's called Nefilat Apayim, where we fall down. Okay, we don't actually fall on the ground, but we lean over, put our head down, etc. So that's an interesting point. And yes, they're certainly picking up on the word Amidah. But I guess what I'm driving at is that I think they're understanding that the particular prayer, there's Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, it's not just that we have three prayers, but that the particular prayer that Avram is praying is related to who, in fact, Avram is. The fact that Abraham is praying, the prayer over here, the Amidah, is not for himself at all. He's completely removed from it. Okay, it's his nephew, but it's a nephew who has parted ways. And nonetheless, Avram feels some kind of responsibility, and he is going back, continuing to pray. And he's doing it first thing in the morning as well. And as you point out very well, it's not the only time that he gets up early in the morning. So there's something about Avram in general that suggests, I mean, he is the Av, he's the first. He's the father of the people. So the idea of this person who actually starts something, he actually invents something, one might say. He's the inventor of this particular religion, right? He's the one who starts us off. So his prayer is also part and parcel of that. His prayer is not in the middle of the day. It's not the end of the day. His prayer is Vayashkem Avram Baboker. So we have a couple of different interesting features over here. The idea of starting the day with prayer, which is what he does over here. The idea that I have a fixed place for prayer. I think I want to think about that some more. We should all think about it. What that suggests of having a fixed place. I think we'll come back to that idea of the fixed place. But here's where you see it straight out. And so yeah, and that basically Lot is, and that this prayer seems to work. That actually that Lot is, God is remembering Lot on account of the fact that Abraham is actually praying for Lot. And that's, of course, none of this is explicit in the text at all. And that's not our issue, whether it's explicit or not, but at least this is a rabbinic reading, or they're offering us a particular reading of the story over here. So this is the first. He's the first, and he does the first thing in the morning is to pray, and he's continuing. He goes back to the same place. He is continuing what he did yesterday. It's a continuation. It's a continuation. Okay, and that says something about prayer. It's not just a mitzvah. It's part of life, actually. You continue where you left off. I remember when I was in yeshiva, my first Rebbe was Rabbi Lichtenstein, Aaron Lichtenstein, terrific Rebbe. And I remember he would, never wasted a second, he would walk into the room, carry about 15 books, and he's walking from the door to his desk. And on the way to the desk, he said, as we said yesterday, he was continuing, 24 hours ago, he continues. As we said yesterday, before he sits down, and that's the idea over here of continuing, that this is my life, yes, okay, prayer. Other things happen, we have to stop. We can't pray all the time, but in a sense, we should be praying all the time. We might be praying all the time, and that's part of this continuing, being in the same place. I'm just continuing my prayer. Yesterday, we spoke about the 10. I want to continue now. What about Lot? That's the way they're taking it. Okay, let's go back to the Gemara, because let's continue in the Gemara. You have it there, fine. Now the Gemara says, Yitzchak, that's Avram. Yitzchak tikein tfilat mincha. As far as Yitzchak is concerned, he instituted the afternoon prayer, mincha, as it says. Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach b'asada lifnot areh v'yemsicha el tefillah. Shenemar tefillah le'ani ki hatov v'lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. So Isaac instituted the afternoon prayer as it is written. Isaac went out, lasuach means to talk, to converse in the field toward evening before nightfall. And what does lasuach mean? Siach means prayer, as it says in Tehillim. Lifnei Hashem yishpoch sicho. So whereas now let's think about this for a moment. And this verse, Vayetze Yitzchak lasuach b'asadeh lifnot arev, and it says he lifted up his eyes and behold, camels were coming, Rivka's coming. I think when you read the verse, I think most people would not translate this verse as Isaac went out to pray towards evening. Lasuach b'asadeh, sicha, means to speak. Yes, if you're speaking to God, we would call that prayer. But it doesn't say he went out to speak to God. It says he went out to speak, to converse. Lasuach b'asadeh. So the rabbinic reading of this, the rabbinic interpretation, Lasuach b'asadeh lifnot areh, he went out to converse. Okay, they're taking it as a kind of prayer. And presumably, their understanding is, what is he praying for? What is Isaac praying for? Presumably what he's praying for is he knows that his father has sent out his servant to find him a wife, and he's praying, presumably, that the servant was successful, and lo and behold, he lifts up his eyes, and he sees the camels approaching, and he realizes that in fact, the servant has been successful, that his beloved intended wife is coming towards him. That's, I think, the rabbinic understanding of the verse. Okay, now let's think about not the rabbinic understanding of the verse. Let's try to figure out what this verse actually seems to be saying and the relevance to prayer. So there's something interesting about this pasuk, actually. The first pasuk, he went back to the place where he prayed. Okay, maybe he prayed Amidah. Here it doesn't sound like he's praying. It sounds like he's talking. He went out in the field to talk, to converse before evening. What's interesting is Vasuach Basadeh, because the word Siach HaSadeh, Siach HaSadeh is a phrase that appears in the beginning of the Torah, in the very second chapter of the Torah. Siach HaSadeh are the things that grow from the field. So Isaac is going out, Vasuach Basadeh is a play on the term Siach HaSadeh. And what that suggests is something very interesting. You have this in some of the Hasidic texts with Nachman. He sees himself as part of nature's conversation. He's going out, Suach Basadeh, and that's Yitzchak. Yitzchak is connected to the Sadeh in the deepest way. The Sadeh for Yitzchak is not just a geographical space, such as the Avram and Yaakov are living in a land which has boundaries and borders, but they're not connected to the land the way Yitzchak is. Yitzchak never leaves, and I don't mean just the space, the actual earth. Remember when Yaakov comes in to get the blessing, pretending to be Esav, and he smells the coat that Yaakov is wearing, Esav's coat. It says, the coat is the coat of the field that God has blessed. So Isaac sees himself in his prayer, because they're understanding that he's praying, but it's Lasuach Basadeh. He sees himself as part of the world which is praying. For Yitzchak, the world, which is God's creation, is constantly in a state of prayer. The sounds of nature that we don't hear in the city. If you go outside the city and you pay attention, you can actually hear, it's actually very noisy sometimes. The crickets and all the animals making noise. And one way to wonder, they're all praying, they're all crying out to God in one form or another. And Yitzchak sees himself as part of that. That's number one. That's number one. And number two is something else interesting about Yitzchak, which is he goes out to the field to pray with Not Erev, before nightfall. And now the question is what we call mincha. Now the question is, what is this idea of praying at mincha time? And here I have a suggestion as to what they're getting at. And I think that within many of the Hasidic texts, I think that, and maybe the Kabbalistic texts, they actually pick up on this, on the idea of Yitzchak. Abraham is the innovator. Abraham is the first. Abraham gets up in the morning. It's all fresh, it's all new. But Yitzchak is something different. Yitzchak is not an innovator in the sense of Abraham, but Yitzchak's going to pray again. It's not a continuation. It's not a new prayer. It's the same prayer. The only thing is the first prayer wasn't good enough. What Yitzchak represents is the person who's interested in self-improvement. Self-improvement. What I've done is never sufficient. I have to go deeper. I have to do it better. And that's the quality of Yitzchak, actually, what they call midat hadin or gvura or tzimtzum. So Abraham's out to save the world. And Isaac is not out to save the world. The Isaac of the Torah is not out to save, but unlike Abraham, Isaac's relationships are very deep, deeper than Abraham's relationships. Isaac and Rebekah, it's very deep. Prays for Rebekah. Abraham never prays for Sarah. Isaac prays for Rebekah. Isaac's connection to the land is so deep. Isaac's connection to God is so deep, the deepest. When he prays, God, even before he finishes praying, there's something about Isaac, they call him the sacrifice. There's something that's so close, that's so deep. And this idea of seeing myself as never having done enough. That's the idea of mincha. The day's coming to an end. I haven't really prayed yet. Yeah, I prayed this morning. It wasn't good. I can do it better. And that's the idea of Wolf Note Erev. And that's different. And that's because he's a different person. They're both great, but they're totally different. And that's the idea. And here, this verse, actually, the first verse, you could crash and say, okay, maybe you can read that in. Over here, it's difficult to say that Lasuach Basadeh means to pray. But that's the way they're understanding it. And by the way, he goes out to pray and immediately he sees the camel's coming. He doesn't have to wait. He's answered immediately. Immediately. That's the second verse. So let's get back to the Gemara. Let's get back to Yaakov now. So the Gemara says, let's see, Yaakov, where's Yaakov? Further down, where is it? No, back up. You went too far. Too far, 1 second. Yes, no, down a little. Yes, Yaakov tikain tfilat arvit. So Jacob prayed the evening prayer. Jacob prayed the evening prayer. Shenemar, as it is written, Vayifka b'makom, vayolen sham kiva hashemesh, v'yein pigiya el tfilah. Shenemar, v'yatal titpalel b'yad ha'am hazeh v'atisah b'adam rina tfilah al tifka bi. Jacob instituted the evening prayer. As it says, Vayifka b'makom. Now, what does it mean? What is Vayifka b'makom? Where is that pasuk from? So that's where Yaakov's running away from Esav. And it says he encountered the place, Vayifka b'makom, and he goes to sleep there for the sun is setting. And he goes to sleep, he takes a rock, puts it under his head, and he has a dream, staircase to heaven, angels are ascending and descending. And when he wakes up, he says, oh my goodness, this is a holy place. I didn't even know it. Anochi lo yadati, I didn't know it. And here's the point, that verse number 15. Vayifka b'makom can't possibly mean he prayed there. Actually, it means exactly the opposite. Vayifka b'makom means he encountered the place. He unexpectedly, why does he go to sleep there? Because the sun is setting. He has no idea where he is actually till he's sleeping, and he has a dream. And in the dream, he realizes he's in a holy place. He's in the gateway to heaven. So in other words, whereas the first pasuk is a maybe, the second pasuk is highly unlikely, the third so-called proof text, which I'm sure the Gemara is quite aware of, can't possibly mean that he prayed there. Nonetheless, it doesn't matter. Nonetheless, the rabbinic reading over here is Vayifka b'makom, that Yaakov prayed in that place. And the word pigiyah, says the Gemara, can refer to prayer. So as God said to Yirmiyahu, I don't want you to pray for these people. I don't want you to speak on their behalf. V'yal tifga bi, and don't encounter me, don't plead with me, etc. So this is the third. This is Yaakov tikain tfilat arvit. Now, let me first of all repeat a point I made a couple of weeks ago, that whereas if you see the prayers, daily prayers, as relating to the sacrifices, there are in fact only 2 daily sacrifices. There's no sacrifice at night. The evening sacrifice, there is none. It's just the burning of the fats of the first 2 sacrifices, which is why there is an opinion that the evening prayer isn't even mandatory, even rabbinically mandatory. It's just a reshut. One may pray at night if one wishes. One need not pray. But on the other hand, if you look at it from the standpoint of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, there's no reason to assume that the evening prayer carries any less weight than the morning or the afternoon prayer. But they're just very, very different. And in thinking about this particular rabbinic understanding of prayer, that Yaakov is the one who prays the evening prayer. And here the term is pigiyah. Pigiyah. The word lifgoa often carries with it a negative connotation. To injure someone, to wound someone. It can be a violent encounter, a very strong encounter. And over here, Jacob is praying the evening prayer. When is Yaakov praying the evening prayer? When does the story actually take place? It doesn't take place in the field. It doesn't take place when Avram goes back to his assigned place for prayer, but rather it takes place when Yaakov is running away from home. He's on the way to exile. And on the way to exile, he's running and night has come, so you sleep wherever you can. Vayifka b'makom. So they're taking Vayifka b'makom. They're taking makom as a name for God. But in the Torah, makom is not God. Rabbinically, makom can be God's name. But here, it simply means he lighted upon the place. It was the sunset. But the story is a story of a person who's running away, a person who's in exile, a person who's in danger, which is the story of Yaakov. Yaakov represents here the Jew in exile. And Yaakov, in the story over here, if we think about the story of Yaakov, Yaakov's dream, this is where Yaakov takes his vow, and where Yaakov says to God, if you take care of me, O God of Avram and Yitzchak, if you take care of me, then when I come back, I will build the house. And this house, this place that I saw in the dream, this heavenly Jerusalem, I will build an earthly Jerusalem. I will make you my God. I'm going to build you a house. Then this rock, the next verse, right? Next pasuk, one more pasuk. Even azot asher samti matzeva beit Elohim. So in other words, this is a different prayer. This is a prayer of the person who's leaving, who's banished, and the hope that he'll be able to come back. In point of fact, that's Yaakov's story. Yaakov's story in the Chumash, Pshat of the Chumash, he actually encounters Hamakom in the beginning of his career. It took Abraham a lifetime to find the sacred place. Yaakov encounters it right away. He encounters it as he actually is forced to run away. And Yaakov's struggle in life is to return. Yaakov's mission is to find a way to come back. Abraham's mission was to find the place. Yitzchak's mission is to somehow remain in the place and deepen the commitment. And Yaakov's mission is to return. And here, before I stop and take comments and questions, I'll make the following claim. I believe that when we think about prayer, it is certainly true that we begin with the first blessing is Magen Avraham, and we'll see this next week. And the ones who understood this very well, and this is one of the real keys to understanding the Amidah, the ones who understood this to the end were the great poets of Israel, they're called the Paitanim. Eliezer Kalir and his whole, those whole group of people understood a deep truth about the Amidah that we'll get to next week. And once we see it, it's obvious, but it's not obvious till you see it. But in point of fact, I would argue that if you have to pick out a person, one person who was central to the rabbinic prayer, to the Amidah, to this text that's been constructed for us and handed to us many years ago, I would have to go with Yaakov, actually. I think the key person in our prayers, if you have to pick one, it's got to be Yaakov. And I say this for several reasons. But one of the interesting features, and I'll make this last point, and I'll take comments and questions, is that the verb to return, lashuv, appears at least 7 times within the Amidah. It's all about returning. The Amidah is written clearly as a text, which is written, which is addressing of people that are not in the land. And we're asking God to bring us back, to return. Hashevet ha'avoda, bring back the service, bring us back to the land, bring us back to ourselves, right? The idea of teshuvah. So the idea of return, and we'll see this next week, is throughout the Amidah. and the person whose role it is in life to return, not to discover, but to return. That's Jacob's role. And the truth of the matter is, sometimes it's more difficult to return than to find the place, to come back to the place after many years, to return to the place, to find a way to get back. And then when you are back, because it's never going to be exactly the same place, and to deal with a place that is the same but different. And these are Jacob's struggles. This is the story of Yaakov, both the first time he runs away, which is in chapter 28, and Vayifka b'makom, where he doesn't know. And then, of course, at the end of his life, he goes down to Egypt. But he makes his son promise to bring him back. He's the last Jew to return. He comes back. So, as we'll see this next week. But my point is, when we think about the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, those are three different manifestations of God. Has to be, because they're three different people, three different settings, three different roles to play, three different responsibilities. So what the Amidah suggests in the very beginning of it is that there are multiple ways that one connects to God. And the Amidah gives us three possibilities. Three, all of whom prayed and were responded to. And it's an invitation to think, as I said at the outset, to think about where do we stand actually. Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are simply examples. There are many, many other examples as well. The great poets added all kinds of other names into the davening. The Paitanim, and we have some some say the piyutim and Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. So not just Abraham and Sarah, not just Isaac and Rebecca, not just Jacob and Rachel. So the point is that they added these other stories. Everybody has every story is different. But the Amidah becomes suddenly a very rich text and suggests to us multiple possibilities. Again, if I had to pick out one person that is absolutely central to the Amidah as we have it, I believe it would be Yaakov for reasons I'll get to next week. Let me stop over here. And if there are comments and questions, I'm happy to hear. Noah, do we have anything in the chat or anything else?
There are a lot of comments in the chat. If folks would like to share their own comments in their own voices, you're welcome to unmute.
So I started to write it, but it just occurred to me that the Pagia in Yaakov's in really the opening scene of his going into exile is exactly the bookend of the damaging of the angel when in the closing bookend of his exile.
Right, you have Vayifku vo Malachei Elohim, of course, which concludes the story. I mean, it's the end of structure for sure.
I was actually talking about the damaging of the thigh, but
right,
as a Pagia, but you've got the language even in the Machaneh. You're right.
Right, that's right, and it could be that Machaneh is a foreshadowing of the, and that's part of what I mentioned before, that the mission that these, whether it's Avram, whether it's Yitzchak, whether it's Yaakov, that if you're driven to, if you're committed to a goal, Moshe Rabbeinu is the best example, but there may be multiple examples. Yaakov is another good example. Yaakov is a very difficult life. I mean, Yaakov is solely the hero. It's Israel. Look at his life from an objective standpoint. It's pretty much of a train wreck, you know. I mean, whatever could go wrong goes wrong. At the end of the day, though, he succeeds in his mission. He does build the bayit. So it's an understanding that we enter into the prayer with thinking of these stories. I would say foundational stories. We recognize that, you know, the commitment to a particular mission entails with it all kinds of dangers, all kinds of hardships. And the Pagia, yes, does often carry with it a sense of injury, damage. And you point out,
or willing
foreshadows them struggling with the angel and he's wounded.
Willingness to struggle.
Right, yeah. That's for sure. Anybody else have a comment or a question? Noah? I don't care if it's in the chat or not, either way.
Yeah. Gabriella, you've had your hand up for a while and I've invited you to unmute. You're welcome to do that. Otherwise, anyone else?
What about the concept of Magen Avraham?
That either next week or the week after. I will discuss
okay.
that at some length.
Oh, wait.
Actually.
Okay.
That is extremely, I mean, yeah, right. We will get to the Magen either next week or the following week. The first blessing is very, very rich, but I haven't forgotten that, and 100%. Interesting, by the way, is that the Magen Avraham is the text we have, but the Yerushalmi has a different text, Baruch Atah Hashem Magen Avot, which we say on Friday night. The Friday night repetition of the Amidah after the in Ma'ariv, Magen Avot Bidvaro. It's actually it's a miniature repetition of the Amidah, but the text is the text from the Yerushalmi. So Magen Avot is one of the differences. We also have Konei Shamayim Va'aretz. We have Konei Hakol. It's another difference. There's several differences. They have Adon HaShalom. We don't have Adon HaShalom. So there are certain differences, and we will deal with that at some length, actually. And that'll be one of the more interesting things that we encounter. So we haven't forgotten that. We'll 100% get to that. Yeah, and we'll deal with it. And so we begin with Abraham. It's actually very striking who is in our prayers. There's Avram, there's Yitzchak, there's Yaakov, there's David. David's mentioned later in two of the blessings. Conspicuously absent is Moshe. I mean, we have him in the Birkat Kohanim, right? Torah to write Moshe, but without the Birkat Kohanim, which is an addendum to the prayer, Moshe is never mentioned, actually. It's very striking. But Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and David. David is interesting. Mentioned David. And actually, the prayer book is suffused with David. The Psuke de Zimra, David. Shirei David Abdecha. Hashem Elokeinu. So that's very interesting. But we'll get back to Magen Avraham either next week or the following week. That's the plan. Thank you for that. Anybody else? Okay, I guess we'll have to stop then. It's after 9. All right, so we will, if anybody does have any further questions, you can send me email, dsilber@drisha.org. I'm trying to respond as best I can. Noah, do you have any other announcements?
Oh, of course, always. So first of all, thank you, Rabbi Silber, for a tremendous class, and to all of you here on Zoom, on Facebook Live, and on Drisha Live for participating in our learning community. It really is what it is because of your participation. We do have a lot of classes upcoming, including one that I would like to point out starting tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern that I'm personally very excited about navigating the employer-employee relationship. It's going to get into a lot of the halakha about things like unionization and quitting and paying your workers on time and things that are very pertinent to modern times, I'll put it that way, very applicable. So I have the link to that in the chat, and we look forward to seeing you in all of our classes, really, but if not in all of them, then at least back here next week, same time, same place. Please be well.
Thank you very much. I would also put a plug in for that class. I think that he's very interesting, and I think that dealing with issues that are very pertinent to us, and not just to us, to the world, and especially given the whole COVID situation of people, the workplace has changed to a great extent. I think these are even more relevant than ever. So, and he's quite good. So again, it's an opportunity to really think through some of these very important issues. Thank you, Noah, and hope to see you next week. And thank you.